students. I hope you're well and that you're having a nice weekend. Today's Saturday, and I thought I'd just check in, say hi, and go through chapters 9 and 10 with you before we finish the book, Narrative of the Life of a Slave. I hope you've been enjoying it. I sure do miss having in-person discussions with you, and I hope you're all doing well. So, Narrative of the Life of a Slave, let's talk about chapters 9 and 10. And then what I'd like you to do for this week is to read our final chapter 11, but also the appendix as well. So read that, and then I'll post your final assignment in Canvas for this week, and that'll be due on Friday, okay? All right, so chapter 9, we come full circle. So we come full circle back to the plantation, right? Colonel Lloyd's plantation. But he goes to live with Master Thomas Auld at St. Michael's. So Douglas goes back, basically right back to where he started. But this time it's going to be a little bit different. So if you remember in my second lecture series, chapters 1 and 2 through 8, I was sitting right back there, right? And I showed you the view off of our deck. And so I talked about how those first few chapters look at the overview of slavery, right? Douglas talks about the misconceptions and uses counter-argument and does the overview of slavery. But here, I'm sitting in a very similar spot, right? But this view is a little bit different now. Even though you can see the deck behind me, right? I'm inside my living room. And so it's the same view, but now it's from a different location. And just like that, Douglas is going to tell us the same view in terms of, he's still going to tell us about slavery, but this time it's going to be from the inside, just like now I'm inside, right, the house rather than outside. And he's going to be able to tell us a more personal engagement of slavery. And so instead of the overview and talking about the misconceptions, he's going to be talking about the hypocrisy and the irony and the manipulation. And so we see that echoed with a lot of his language choices too. So we see things like anti-metally and antithesis and juxtaposition. And so he places those two things together in order for the reader to draw a conclusion. So, like I said, chapter 9, it's a little bit more brief. We come back to Colonel Lloyd's, but end up at Master Thomas Auld. And he really critiques Thomas Auld pretty heavily here, and talks about here, he came into possession of his slaves by marriage, and of all men, adoptive slaveholders are the worst. So we see that Douglas really thinks, Thomas Auld, he's even more despicable because he wasn't born into this role, he chose it. And so to Douglas, this seems even worse that someone would choose to be a slave owner. So he's really heavily critiques Thomas Auld. In fact, he's almost happy to go to Covey's, which is interesting, right? He's treated very badly here, but you kind of get the sense of, oh, you think this guy is bad, Covey's going to be way worse. And so with Thomas, right, we see when I talked about that juxtaposition, right, or antithesis, while he starved us, he stuffed them, right? And so you see that time and time again, especially throughout the next two chapters. Chapter 10 is preceded by that last paragraph here in 9, where it talks about the qualities of Covey. He was a professor of religion, a pious soul, a member class leader, and also his reputation as a human breaker, right? Or a slave breaker. I was aware of all these facts, having been made acquainted by them. So he knows that he's going to be in the possession of someone whose reputation is that he breaks slaves, right? And breaking becomes kind of a motif in chapter 10. In fact, it opens with a scene where the oxen break the cart, where and Douglas is almost broken right into pieces. And we get the sense that Covey set him up. It was a manipulative ploy in order to get Douglas into a circumstance so he could, in fact, whip him. And Douglas, stands there. He does not. He does not strip, nor does he allow Covey to whip him without a fight. And So Covey has to, kind of fight him into submission, and this really foreshadows the big fight that happens a little bit later, right? That's our turning point. So what's interesting here is he gives us the ending, right, before the actual story, and so that lets you focus on some of the other elements. For example, when he goes to Master Covey's, he's a field hand. I had been at my home but 1 week before Mr. Covey gave me a very severe whipping, cutting my back, causing blood to run, raising the ridges on my flesh as large as my little finger. So we already know the outcome of this particular instance. So we're able to really focus on, why did this happen before we're focused on the outcome of what happened. So that, and that's a tactic because he does it again too. So we'll see. And on page 72, this whipping was the first of a number just like it in similar offenses. I lived for Mr. Covey during 1 year. During the first 6 months of that year, scarce a week passed without his whipping me. I was seldom sore. My awkwardness was almost an excuse for his whipping me. We were worked fully up to the point of endurance, long before, right? And so it says just the first 6 months, right? So, something happens where then the last 6 months, he's not being whipped, and why is that? And so here, of course, Covey is a snake. He's a deceiver, and I think he says he almost deceives himself into thinking that he's a sincere worshiper of God. And now we see really a heavy critique in terms of religious slave owners, and that's one of the huge pieces that Douglas holds on to in terms of his audience. He really connects with the idea of Christianity and the Bible and really understanding religion in order to connect to his readers and show the hypocrisy and the moral and ethical problems with it in terms of, can a Christian then be a slave owner? Those two don't go together, and here's why, ethically and morally. So he uses that, and he also uses, we'll see a lot of allusion, because we know that Douglas is coming at slavery with a different perspective. He's now educated, right? So he can see the manipulation, the nuances, the hypocrisy, the irony in slaveholding, and he wants to show that to the reader. But has to be really, it's a really careful balance about how he does that. He assumes, right, that the reader's ethics and morals would be in line with his, and so they're able to see then the sinful nature of slavery, right? That it really it cannot be justified by religion. So. And then it talks about Covey, and then talks about him being a breeder, right? And he's appalled because he forces his slave to commit adultery, and of course that's not biblically condoned at all. And then we see he's being broken physically, right, and mentally. So can an educated man be broken by slavery is the ultimate question. And Douglas almost breaks, and he's this educated man. And remember, we said before, he said, I was lucky, and not everyone is as lucky as I was. But anyone in my situation would have had the same chance to be educated and become free. It's not that he's an abnormality or the exception to the rule. He's saying slavery is the thing that dehumanizes people. Slaves themselves are not unintelligent or incapable of understanding their plight, and incapable of reading and being educated and equal. So we are worked in all weathers. Work. So we have redundant, and then I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. Sunday was my only leisure time. So here we see that he is at his lowest point. And he goes to, on page 76, he's addressing the beautiful vessels, right? And he even says, I would pour out my soul's complaint in a rude way with an apostrophe to the multitude of ships. So an apostrophe, he's telling us which language device he's using. He's using an apostrophe. He's addressing an inanimate object, putting it on the same, playing field as himself, as a human being, having a conversation with that inanimate object, giving it power. And so he's recognizing or saying, yep, I'm a possession, and people use me as a possession. But you our ship, and you have more freedom even than I do as a human. And then he asks, a series of questions. Is there a God? Why am I a slave? And then we see again that antithesis, the juxtaposition, right? I had as well be killed running than die standing, right? And then we get to that famous anti-mentally, right, with the shift where it says, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." And so the words don't change, just like his situation is not changing when he goes back to Covey's plantation, but his mindset changes. And so the rearrangement of the words mimic that shift in Douglas's mindset, that the words are all the same, right? But now, of course, his mindset changes. So, and what happens, right? He gets into that fight with Mr. Covey, and you can see that lasts pages. So this is clearly the turning point. I mean, chapter 10 is so long, right? If you look at chapter 10 in comparison to the other chapters, it's by far the longest chapter in the book. And why? Well, this is the climactic shift, right? And so he talks about, I should live with, but to die with him. I should live with him, but to die with him. And of course, that's when that fight had started, and he went to tell Master Thomas, and then Thomas sends him back to Covey, and he takes the route, right? And then on page 81, this is a great part. So page 81, it's dashed even, right? So it's set apart from the rest of the text. There's this one defining moment. From whence came the Spirit, I do not know. So this is clearly the moment where everything changes for Douglas, and this is when he resolved to fight, and he grabs Covey by the throat, right? And they fight. So this battle, blah, 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 right? And then he says, I might remain a slave in form. The day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. So again, we talked about that juxtaposition. Okay, and then down in parallel structure, right? So yes, it's the same situation, but his mindset is totally different. And then so down here, his term of service ends with Covey on Christmas Day of 1833. And now we shift back into that bigger view of slavery, because he's going to be talking about the holiday and really this manipulation of goodness. So just like the manipulation of religion, right? Just like the manipulation of religion to justify slavery, we have the holiday, which is manipulated, right? It's supposed to be this gift, this goodness, but it's not. It's manipulated by the slave owners in order to show the slaves that they can't handle freedom. And then Douglas cites a series of manipulations that slave owners use. So, for example, if the molasses example, then feeding the slave molasses until they can't even, so they probably vomit and can't even think about having molasses again. So kind of that manipulation of goodness. And then he goes to Mr. Freeland, which is really a happy coincidence, because this is where his first attempt at escaping comes. Mr. Freeland is really the path to his ultimate escape from slavery. And so we see Reverend Daniel Whedon, Reverend Rigby Hopkins, Mr. Whedon, and of course how they beat their slaves and mistreat them, even though they're supposed to be these, pious people. He compares a lot of the slave owners, Mr. Freeland to Mr. Covey, etc. So this is really interesting. And then he talks about, of course, connecting with the other slaves and teaching them to read. And we talked about this just a little bit ago. Why this is important? It's because it's an argument for slavery, right? Frederick Douglass wants to point out that it's not just about him, that he is a representative of all slaves, that all of them have the capability to be as articulate and educated and free and useful and equal. So he's not just an abnormality. This is any slave. And so of course he talks about how the other slaves that he met, they wanted to learn to read, they wanted to escape, they understood their situation, and so of course they try to escape. And they are, they're found out. And he of course says he refers to Patrick Henry, which is supposed to be a connection to the audience. It's obviously an allusion to the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was a fight right against the British, and so he's drawing that parallel for the audience. Again, you wanted your freedom. What's wrong with slaves wanting our freedom? And so we have and he wrote the note, the passes, and they are betrayed. They are betrayed, and then he finds himself in jail, and he thinks, well, this is it. I'm being sold to Alabama, and that's it. That's I tried to make my escape, it didn't work, but I knew that could be a real possibility. But that's not true. Actually, what happens is Captain Auld comes back, and then he gives him back to Master Hugh. And so he goes to Master Hugh, and he's going to learn a trade so he can earn money for his master. And this is, again, when he learned to read, and become educated, this opened a whole new perspective and reality and view of slavery. So what do you think learning a trade is going to do, He's going to learn independence. He's going to have a craft. He's going to be able to support himself. So this idea that not only can he be educated, but useful, Work in the workforce, and he does that. And then, of course, there's the huge fight at his first job, and Hugh is actually really upset about it and very upset that nothing can be done about it. So he actually won't let him go back to Mr. Gardner's shipyard. He tells him nope, and he finds him a different place to work. So, but you can see at the end that with this new freedom, and each time that Douglas experiences that new freedom, he's drawn to ultimate freedom. He wants to be his own master. And so he kind of resolves here. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be able to feel that slavery is right. And he'd be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man. So he says, slavery, once I realized that that slavery isn't right, that people aren't justified in making me a slave, that I didn't, that victim blaming, blaming the victim and the victim blaming themselves. He's educated enough to know that that's not the truth, and now he's vowed to live out his truth. And so we'll see in chapter 11, we know he does escape. But what is that like? Is it the ultimate freedom he's always dreamed of, or is it more of a be careful what you wish for, because there's always going to be challenges no matter what. So we're going to see that in chapter 11. So enjoy reading chapter 11, and don't forget to read the appendix. The appendix is right after that, and that starts on page 120. So read those two. I have the final assignment, which is a lot like the very first assignment, and that'll be due Friday. And I am working on all of your chapters 2 through 8 right now, and I'll make sure I get those comments back to you. I hope you are all doing well. I miss you terribly, and we'll see you soon. If you need to contact me, feel free. I'm happy to answer any questions for you guys. Miss you all. Bye.